Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Enrique Jiménez. We're going to be talking about a really interesting text from the ancient world that seems to talk about some type of monotheism, which is really interesting because a lot of these cultures were polytheistic. So there's a really interesting thing going on here where Marduk, the Babylonian god, is presented as the only god. What's going on there? How are you doing today, Dr. Enrique?
Fine, thank you very much for the invitation today.
Awesome. It's my pleasure. So people can check out your work in the description. There's going to be a number of different links that people can check out to learn more about what you've done, as well as the specific paper they can read from that we're talking about today. But just to get into it, could you just briefly summarize to my audience what you wrote about in your paper, Literary Texts from the Sipar Library 3, Eriš, šummi, a syncretistic hymn to Marduk?
Thank you, Zach. So the main point of the article is to make available to the modern world an ancient text, a text that is around the year 1000 BC. We'll talk about it more later, and that was completely unknown. And we published it for the first time in this paper, and then we analyze it in different ways. I want to show a bit what the text was found and describe why it wasn't known before. For that, I will ask you to show the slides.
Oh, one. Let's find it.
Yeah, let me. The slide exactly. Yeah. So this is. We are now in a very exciting place. This is a library that was found by the Baghdad University, the College of Arts of Baghdad University, in the city of Sipar, which is around an hour from Baghdad. Sorry, and it was the first time that we found a library in situ. So the tablets were kept in the niches, in the shelves, so to say, where they were stored in antiquity. And each one of these shelves was completely full of cuneiform tablets. That was, as I said, the year 1986. If you go to the next, I think I can go to the next slide. Yeah. So this was discovered, as I said, in 1985, and they discovered around 300 cuneiform tablets and many fragments, and only a tiny part of it is published so far because of the circumstances of Iraq, right? They had a dictatorship, they have several wars, and they have a civil war, and only now is the country starting to recover to the point that you can continue to do this sort of scientific research. This at the top is a 3D reconstruction of the library that we made. Using old excavation photos, and when it was discovered, it was really a sensation. Benjamin Foster described it as the kind of discovery that one waits 100 years to see, and it was really something sensational because you had all the missing pieces of the text that everyone was trying to read, all in this tiny space of perhaps 4 square meters, 40 square feet. In this tiny library, you found everything that you needed. Unfortunately, as I said, the publication stopped in the early 2000s because of the invasion of Iraq and then the civil war that followed and so on. But now we are resuming it. In the last few years, we have published a series of articles with, again, all of them with very exciting new texts. And the one that we will be talking about is number 3, this one, the Eriš, šummi, a syncretistic hymn to Marduk. Also relevant for this discussion is number 4, which is a hymn to Ninurta. We call it a Macranthropic hymn to Ninurta. I'll explain later what it means, but it's also sort of a syncretistic hymn only to another god. Yeah. And that was the main point of the article. And if you can share just one more slide. Yeah, this is the tablets, the main manuscript of the text. That was, as you can see, it's almost intact. There is only a tiny bit missing at the top, but gladly we have another piece that restores this section in particular, and only this tiny bit here that you can see is missing. So we basically, and the reverse is also full of text. So we basically have a long text of around 100 lines, very closely written, that is new. So the point of the article was to, as I said, to edit this text and to discuss what the text says.
Very, very fascinating. Okay. And could you just give, just for my audience, what we're going to talk about today? Could you just give a brief summary about what you think this text is claiming about the idea of kind of looks like monotheism, but it isn't, and what's going on with that?
Mhm. So yeah, the most exciting thing about the text is that it says that all gods are just names of Marduk. Yeah? So it will
Hmm.
say Shamash, who is the sun god, is a name of Marduk, or Ninuta, who is one of the main gods, is also a name of Marduk, and so on and so forth. I wanted to, so there's an edition of the text that you can find online. That's the first link that I sent you. We can look at it to see how it begins and how it continues and how it formulates the question. So
This one?
yeah, exactly. So it begins with a short hymn to Marduk. He says, he of insightful thinking, the wise one, the most discerning of the Igigi. So he praises Marduk as a wise god. He's the learned lord. He's king of keen sagacity. He's the sage of the gods. He's a very clever god. Most of them are traditional epithets of Marduk, but here the focus seems to be on how clever he is. Yeah? Then when you go to line 16, it says, the warrior Marduk, whose names are terrifying for the borders of heaven and earth, who in his might rules heaven and earth, who has magnified his name. And here begins the exciting part of the text. Yeah? And the second section of the text, which begins here, contains a list of god names that are said to be just names of Marduk. So your name is noble Ansha, the father of the gods, and so on. So Ansha is a name of Anu, which in the Mesopotamian traditional theology is the greatest god, the god of heaven. Yeah, and then in line 21 you can see after this string of epithets, it says your name is indeed Marduk. Yeah? For those who know Akkadian, it says Tsikirka, which is one of the forms of saying your name. Marutuk Ma. And this Ma is particularly relevant what it means. So Marutuk is Marduk, yeah, the Babylonian way of saying Marduk. And the Ma is a particle that adds emphasis. But what sort of emphasis does it add? One of the ways of translating it would be your name is actually Marduk. So your name is only Marduk. So you may be called Anshar, but your real name is Marduk. Yeah? So this the interpretation of this particular particle, which appears in each section that follows, is particularly theologically relevant in this text. Yeah? How exactly you translate it changes the meaning of the text in a way. So in the next section is the god Dagon, which is known, of course, from the Bible as Dagon. But in this case, it doesn't mean that actually the god Dagon is one of the names of Enlil, which in the traditional Mesopotamian pantheon is the second in command after Anu. And the third section in line 26 is Ninshiku, which is a name that no one has heard probably of in your audience, but it's just a name of Ea, Enki Ea, who in the Mesopotamian pantheon is the third in command after Anu and Enlil. So in this text is saying every single god in the pantheon, one after the other, from number 1 to number 10, they're all just names of Marduk. Yeah? So if you go then to the last section, which should begin around line. So all these are other gods, and around line 60 maybe should begin the last section.
Around 60.
Yeah. Yeah, so in line 61 begins, yeah? So United is in Greece, so that's the last section where gods are equated with Marduk, and this line 61 begins, you have become great, O Lord, you have magnified your name everywhere, and then this is another hymn to Marduk where he is presented as a king, as the king of the gods. Yeah? So then the text has some sort of narrative behind it. At the beginning, Marduk is wise, then he assumes the names of all the gods, and then he's great because he has assumed the names of all the gods.
That's really, really fascinating. Wow. Okay. And so that's like a brief summary. And how many tablets have we found of this text right here?
So the most important one is the one that I showed you. But apart from that one, we have 7 manuscripts.
Oh wow.
If you navigate this page, you will be able to see a list of them. An interesting thing is that one of the manuscripts, it's a variant composition. So it has some lines from this text, but if you turn the tablet over on the reverse, it has a list of names of Enlil, not of Marduk any longer. So they have adapted this text somehow in order to dedicate it to Enlil, not to Marduk, which is a bit strange because Enlil in this text is said to be just one of the names of Marduk. Yeah? But it's so close to this text that it must have taken lines and put them in order to create a new composition.
That is extremely fascinating. Oh man. All right. And when was it written?
Yeah. So it's very unclear when it's impossible to date the composition of any text from Mesopotamia.
Okay.
Not even the most important ones we know when they were composed. We know that they didn't exist in one period, but they exist in another period. But when exactly they begin to exist is unclear. That is the case with Enuma Elish, the Epic of Creation, or with the various versions of Gilgamesh and so on. That is the case also with this text. So we know that the text doesn't exist for most of the second millennium BC, and it exists for most of the first millennium BC. The oldest manuscript is from around the 8th, 7th century BC. Because of some internal evidence and because of the distribution of the text, we can assume that it was composed perhaps at the end of the second millennium or beginning of the first millennium BC. So around the year 1000, we can say.
Wow, thank you. All right. And could you explain the role of Marduk in this hymn? You've briefly talked about it, but why does the text focus on him so much as the central figure?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So Marduk is familiar to most people as the most important god in Mesopotamia. Yeah? But he was not always the most important god in Mesopotamia. In the second millennium BC, at the beginning of the second millennium BC, he was a completely irrelevant god, a completely minor god that no one knew, a god of a city that also no one knew, which was called Babylon. Babylon only started rising in prominence in the first quarter of the second millennium BC. So when Babylon started rising in power, so Babylon is, in comparison with other cities from Mesopotamia like Nippur or Uruk or Ur, completely irrelevant in the third millennium. Yeah, only in the second millennium it start gaining relevance, and as it begins gaining relevance, it wants to also have a pedigree, yeah? And it starts taking things from other cities. First of all, it takes the name from the city of Eridu, which was one of the oldest cities. So Eridu becomes sort of a second name of Babylon. Takes the mythology from other cities, and then it has to promote their own god, which is Marduk. And this, what is called in the discipline as the exaltation of Marduk, takes place over many centuries. So, as I said, Babylon started gaining relevance in the first quarter of the second millennium, but it takes many, many centuries for Marduk to rise to the head of the pantheon. And when exactly he rises to the head of the pantheon is also not entirely known. We don't have any text that said we have made Marduk now the head of the pantheon. But we assume that it took place in the last quarter of the second millennium. So around the year 1250, 1150, or 1050, around this time. Yeah, when Marduk rose to the head of the pantheon, there were many compositions that were composed to celebrate this fact and to sort of render some legitimation to it. The most important one was the Epic of Creation, right? Which is called the Epic of Creation, but it's actually a text about the exaltation of Marduk, about how Marduk is the most important of all gods. And this text that we are reading today also has to do with this process of the exaltation of Marduk. Yeah? He's not only is he the king of the gods, also all other gods are just names of Marduk.
Very fascinating. Wow. Okay. And in this text, the hymn equates Marduk with other major gods of Mesopotamian pantheon. So, why do you think the author is doing this? What is he claiming by doing this?
Yeah. So if we may go back to the presentation, the next slide.
Hopefully, there you go.
No, the presentation. Sorry, not the website.
There you go.
Exactly. Yeah. This is a very well-known text, and it's been known since the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It's the so-called Pinches list. And Pinches is the name of the first person who discovered it. Yeah? And this text says, Urash is Marduk of planting. Lugalida is Marduk of the abyss. Ninurta is Marduk of the pickaxe. Nergal is Marduk of warfare. Tababa is Marduk of battle. And so on. So each god is said to be Marduk of a particular, in a particular capacity. Yeah?
Uh-huh.
There is a link also to a modern edition of the text in the links, and maybe you can share it later for people to look at it. Yeah?
Okay, yeah.
So Mesopotamians usually do not formulate principles. Instead of that, they give lists, and lists just show how the principles work, but the principles themselves you have to deduce for yourself, right? That's how lexical lists in Mesopotamia work, and many other things work. This also works in the same way. So the general principle here seems to be all gods are just Marduk in a specific capacity. Yeah? And so this has been called a syncretistic hymn. So all gods are syncretized, so made one with Marduk. When this list, was published, it produced sort of a commotion at the time, particularly because Friedrich Delitzsch, who was perhaps the most important archaeologist at the time, used it in one of his the lectures that he delivered in front of the Kaiser of the German Empire back then.
Wow.
And the Kaiser was also an Orientalist, and he also published books in this regard. And in this lecture, which was called Babel und Bibel, so Babel and the Bible, so Babylon and the Bible, he claimed that the Bible didn't invent anything. They just took everything from the Mesopotamians. As an example, he cited this text. He said the Bible didn't even invent monotheism. Monotheism was already invented by the Babylonians. Yeah, and this is the book where he published his lecture, and he said at the bottom here that some Babylonians were teaching openly that Nabu and the moon god and the sun god and all the gods are simply names of Marduk. They are they are one with Marduk. So there's only one god, Marduk, who can manifest himself in many different ways. This was at the time when it was published in the early 20th century, created a great scandal. And you can see here's the number of people who talked about this particular text. After 1902, when Delitzsch published this book, until 1904, there was something like 10 different people who addressed the interpretation of this text. And it was very famous also because the Kaiser was somehow involved, and it's called as the Babel-Bible strike, so the Babylon Bible fight. And in the newspapers, they published this caricature of Delitzsch fighting against Stöcker, one of the people who opposed his thesis. Yeah, and they composed this poem that said, Schrift heißt es, all die Weilen, weil sie mit ihrer Schriften keilen. So it is called cuneiform because they are always watching each other with their writings, because it was such a scandal in the society of the time that a person would claim that the Bible didn't invent anything. All scholars, without exception, opposed the interpretation by Delitzsch.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And because it was such a big sort of commotion, right? Delitzsch was, again, the most important archaeologist of his time. So he wasn't a nobody. He was a very important personality. And the fact that so many people fought with him sort of condemned this text to ostracism. This text was forgotten and not discussed again for many years. So even today, we don't know exactly what this text means. It's been discussed many times, as you can imagine, but we don't really know what it means that Tababa is Marduk of battle. What are they trying to convey here? Is it that Tababa is Marduk, or that Marduk is Tababa when he's involved in battle, or that Tababa can be one of the names of Marduk? It's not entirely clear. Yeah, so that's the hymn that we have now, this Eriš šummi text, is sort of an exposition of this tiny list it takes the list and it sort of the list explodes into a complete text where it tells us basically the same thing that the list said, that Enlil is Marduk when it's related to lordship and consultation, but it does it in a much more elaborate way, also formulating some principles about the name, and the name is in the text the most important word. What it means that Marduk takes the name of someone else. Yeah? In Mesopotamia, saying that something gets a name is a way of saying that something exists. Yeah, that's the first word in Enuma Elish is when heaven above did not have a name. Yeah, and earth below was not called anything yet. That's a way of saying they did not exist. So the name is sort of the essence of the thing, an entity that cannot be separated from the thing. So by assuming the name of the god, you're also assuming their essence. And that is apparently what this list and what the Eriš šummi text are saying. The Marduk takes the name of all of the gods and therefore takes their essence. So all the gods exist with Marduk.
Wow. That's really, really fascinating, especially the history behind that. So just for some clarity here, so the text we have on the screen, that's not the text that you wrote in the paper on the tablet that we found, but this is the text, the tablet that we talked about before is like a greater explanation of this text, or is it just something similar?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, they're not related to each other in that one of them doesn't say this is an explanation of this other text, but it's clear that they both originated in the same milieu, right? That there are people developing these ideas that this god is Marduk when he does this, and this god is Marduk when he does that. It's the same idea that you have in the hymn. So as I said, this list was published long ago, and it was one of the causes of the Babel-Bible strife, of the Bible-Bible fight. But the sorry, but it is the hymn that we publish now is sort of the same idea, only developed over 100 lines.
Wow, that's crazy. All right, and did you have anything else you wanted to add in regards to how scholars interpret this aspect in comparison to other Mesopotamian texts like the Enuma Elish?
Yeah, I do. So, there is also a link to the relevant section of Enuma Elish. Maybe you can open it. It's
you sent me the link, didn't you?
Yeah.
All right. It's not that one. Okay, so it's this one. All right, and what line would it be on?
We can just open the whole
Okay.
So as you know, the first few tablets of Enuma Elish are about the fight between Marduk and Tiamat. Yeah. Then the tablet 5 is about the creation of the universe. Yeah. And at the beginning of tablet 6 also has that. But then the rest of tablet 6 and tablet 7 is about the names of Marduk. Yeah. Marduk received 50 names that are declared in this text in the entirety. So if you go, for instance, to the line to do with Adu, I think it should be number a bit up. It should be number 120. Yeah, and number 119. Yeah, so Adu should be his name. The soul sky he shall cover. His beneficent roar shall thunder over the earth, and so on and so forth. So it is a very similar text. It says one of the names is Marduk. So one god is Marduk, and often they speak about the name. So Adu shall be his name. So his name is Adu. His name is Asharu, and so. So the spirit is very similar. The main difference is that all these gods, Neberu, Asharu, Gibil, they're completely irrelevant gods. They were all merged with Marduk in prehistoric times, most of them. So Marduk assumed the personalities of all these gods in most cases, before we can actually document it. So there are names of Marduk in the sense that Allah also has many names, right? And they're sort of epithets of Marduk, or they're gods that were merged with him very early on. As I said, when Babylon became the most important world power, they needed to exalt Marduk. And one of the ways of doing that was to say, Marduk, he actually is this other god who is particularly well known. Yeah? Or Marduk, he actually is Gibil, say, who is a very well known god. Yeah. So the main difference is that all these gods are very small gods that were actually merged with Marduk at some point. In our text, in Eriš, šummi, the gods that are listed are not minor gods; they are the major gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, and they were never, as far as we can tell, merged with Marduk. So they all had their individual cult and things like that. Well, most of these gods never had any cult, right? They are just different ways of saying Marduk. So the main difference is that Enuma Elish has sort of retrospective list, so it looks at the past and say all these gods are actually Marduk, whereas Eriš, šummi is sort of a prospective way of looking at it. These are the gods that we want to be merged, that we want to merge with Marduk. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. Okay, and let's see what else we have. How does
may I say something else? Yeah.
Sure.
So the question is, who was convinced that this is the case? Who wanted to merge Marduk or all the major gods with Marduk? Yeah? A very prominent scholar of the 20th century said that this monotheism, as he calls it, he claims that this is actual monotheism, not this in Enuma Elish, but the one that we have in our text in Eriš, šummi. Yeah. He says that this is monotheism. It's a monotheism that you get at via rather tortuous way, right? You have to match all these gods in order to say that Marduk is the only god. So it's a monotheism that is created in a different way from saying the Bible, where you say no other god exists, only this one is our god. In this case, you create monotheism by taking all the other gods and putting them together into one personality. Yeah? Not by rejecting their existence, by actually accepting them and merging them into one personality. So this very prominent scholar said that this is proper, legitimate monotheism, but that it was practiced by very few people. Yeah? This is basically the same idea that Elish had. So the person who initiated the Babel-Bible strike, he said that there were only a few sort of enlightened spirits who were preaching that all the gods are just Marduk. Yeah? But we don't have any evidence that that is the case. The text Eriš, šummi is well known. There are 7 manuscripts of it. There are many texts that we know in fewer manuscripts. Is cited here and there, is kept in normal libraries, so there's no particular evidence that this text was particularly marginal or that only a small group of people were trying to push this monotheistic agenda. Yeah? Instead, I would argue that this agenda is not actually monotheistic, but something else, and that it was sort of the same agenda that you'll already find in Enuma Elish and other texts. But perhaps we can talk later about it.
Okay, sounds good. All right. And how would you say that this hymn that we're talking about today, it differs from the traditional hymns or mythologies involving other gods like Enlil, Ea, and Ninurta, stuff like that?
So it is quite extraordinary that you say that a god is another god. There are very few texts that do that. In the discipline, they are called syncretistic texts, and we don't know more than 5 or 6 that actually do that. And none does it in such an elaborate way as Eriš, šummi, also known is as long as that one. But I wanted to show an example also from the slides. Yeah, so this one is the next tablet from the CPAL library that we published, and it's a syncretistic hymn to Ninurta. Yeah? And in this case, it's a bit, or it's been called a bizarre text, a very strange text that doesn't make any sense, because it says that the gods are not names of Ninurta, they are body parts of Ninurta. So the text says, your face is Shamash, who is the sun god, right? Because his face is so radiant that he's actually Shamash. Your hair is Nisava, who is the grain goddess, because, you know, his hair looked like grains. Your eyes are Enlil and Ninlil. The pupils of your eyes are Gula and Beletili. Your eyebrows are Sin and Nergal, yeah, because Sin, the moon god, sort of looks like an eyebrow. Your eyelids are the rays of the sun. The nose is Ishtar of the stars. Your ears Ea and Damkina, Anu and Antu are your lips, and your teeth, your cheeks are this and that, and your head is another god. Yeah. So people have called this text because we knew a few portions of this text, but now with the new manuscript of the Sipar library, we can read it completely now. And in the past, people have called it a text in very poor taste. Yeah, because it's so sort of vivid the way that it's described, that is syncretism in a very graphic way. Yeah. So if you try to match all the body parts of Ninuta, this is a representation of Ninuta from antiquity, you get something like this. So the eyelids are the rays of the sun, the teeth are the spetu, the throat is this, the neck it does, and it's a very creative way of describing monotheism. Now, you will think that this text completely contradicts Eriš, šummi, right? In Eriš, šummi, Ninuta is just a name of Marduk. In this text, Marduk is the neck of Ninuta. So you will think that both hymns are contradictory, that you cannot have one and the other. You must choose. Do you choose Ninuta or do you choose Marduk? Yeah?
Right.
Is Marduk Ninuta or is Ninuta Marduk? Well, for the Mesopotamians, it wasn't relevant at all because both texts were kept in the same library, actually not only the same library, in the same shelf of the same library. So in this shelf here, we found both texts, the one devoted to Ninuta and the one devoted to Marduk. So the two texts are different. The two texts are very openly contradictory, but the Babylonians didn't have any problem reading them at the same time, or even storing them at the same time in the same shelf, in the same library, in the same sanctuary of a different god. Yeah, this is the sanctuary of the main god of Sipar, who is the sun god. Still,
so this whole thing wasn't even in a specific god to Ninuta or Marduk.
No,
it's a completely different god.
Exactly, yeah. So the Mesopotamians saw nothing contradictory about keeping this in the same place in a sanctuary of another god. So what exactly these texts mean, how relevant they are for the theology, I think you have to consider all these factors, that they are kept in the same shelf, two contradictory hymns in the same library, in the same sanctuary of another god.
Wow. That's something. But that's also really, really cool. So side topic. So how was all these texts found? Was it just like a bunch of piled dirt and they had to remove the dirt, or did they just open up some random room that nobody had been in for thousands of years?
Yeah, exactly. So, so there was an archaeologist, if you may call it that, in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, it was before archaeology was invented as a science. So they were not actually they were just actually digging for finding tablets and sending them over to Europe or the US. By some miracle, he missed this tiny room because it looked like it wasn't a room because a wall had collapsed and he couldn't get in. So he thought it was just a wall. And so in the 1980s, as I said, a team of the University of Baghdad went there again, and an archaeologist who was working there, who was particularly clever, Tuhai Rajab, he realized that there was something behind this wall, and he removed it, and then he found this library, this small room full of treasures.
Wow, that's awesome. And was it like all clean or was it all messed up?
It was all messed up, and only so we suspect that the room was looted in antiquity because only around 15% of the niches were full. So the niches were full at 15% of their capacity. Yeah. So 85% of the niches were empty, or the library was using only 15% of its capacity. And then we have found fragments of the same tablet in different niches. So you will find a fragment of a tablet here and another fragment of the same tablet here. Yeah. So it was looted in antiquity or disturbed in antiquity in a way that we can no longer reconstruct.
Wow, that is something. That's crazy. Okay, I didn't want to get you distracted there, but that's really, really interesting. All right, and did you have anything else to add about how this hymn portrays Marduk different than Enlil, Ea, and Ninurta? Anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, well, no. No, I think the most important thing is that in Enuma Elish, it's looking at things that had already happened, and in this text is looking at things that haven't happened as far as we know. That Anu was never another name of Marduk, or Enli was never another name of Marduk. But this text and also the Pinterest list claim that they are.
Fascinating. Okay. And so you talked in your paper, at least, about how there seems to be a list of names of 11 gods in the text, and the names of the gods are mentioned with uncommon names. So it seems possible that some gods are repeated with different names. What's going on here? Do you know what the author is trying to communicate by doing that?
Yeah, so the text is very clearly trying to present itself as a legitimate text, as a learned composition at the same level as other texts, and it uses vocabulary that is very recherche that you wouldn't find in any other text. And in some cases, it makes up some words, and it uses many words that we can only find in Enuma Elish. Yeah? So it's clearly trying to convey that it is a text at the same level as other texts. And one of the things that the Mesopotamians do when they want to be very clever is to use obscure names of gods and also of people sometimes. And this seems to be what the text is doing, using obscure names of gods. There are repetitions, but because we have two names that we know are usually names of a god, but you may as well say, well, they're not names of a god. They're actually two different gods that are presented under two different names, or perhaps one of the names represents yet another god, and it's difficult to tell. But the reason why gods have these outlandish names is because the author of the text is trying to be clever and to convey that he's very clever and that the text is a legitimate text.
Very fascinating. So this is the text that we're talking about. Can you give us an example of how they'll use one name and then later use another name for that's the same god?
Yeah. So if you scroll down, there is Ningirsu somewhere, right? Down there. So, for instance, here Nanaru Ningirsu is line 57. We know that normally Ningirsu is a name of Ninuta. It's one of the ways of Ninuta. And then later we have Uta. If you look for Uta, or perhaps earlier, it appears earlier.
Earlier.
Here in line 41. Your name is Utaulu. We know that Utaulu is usually also a name of Ninuta. Yeah? So this god is apparently repeated, but again, maybe Utaulu is actually the god Utaulu, who, apart from as a name of Ninuta, we barely know, and Ningirsu is actually the god Ningirsu, or perhaps Utaulu represents another god, and Ningirsu represents another god. Yeah, who knows?
So it's a little ambiguous, but at the same time, really odd. Yeah. Well, really fascinating. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Not about the learned names. No.
Names. Okay. All right. So let's see what else we have here. The hymn shares similarities with other Mesopotamian religious texts, such as Enuma Elish. I think you might have already talked about this actually. In what ways is Eriš a derivative work, and what aspects does it borrow?
So first of all, it borrows some words that only exist in Enuma Elish, apart from this text. Second, it borrows the structure as well. Enuma Elish, the list of names that is sort of the apotheosis in Enuma Elish at the end of the text is also very important. Here at the beginning, you have sort of a prologue, then you have the list of names, and then you have the epilogue, and it's the same way that the Enuma Elish 6 and 7 work, sort of the same structure. You can also see there is a derivative work because it uses some very clever expressions that Mesopotamians will only use when they are trying to write very sort of poetic texts. And if you go back to the edition,
this is Eriš.
So the way, one of the things that Mesopotamians do is to try to express the same thing with different words. But of course, you always, at the end, you run out of words, right? There's no more way to say heaven, or no more way to say netherworld. But they keep on going, and they have, in this text, they have at least 5 or 6 different ways of saying heaven and netherworld. And if you go to line 80, I think it is. Yeah, we try to convey this in the translation. Mighty light of the Igigi and the Anunnaki, protector of Welkin and Tartarus. These are very strange words in line 80. They're very strange words to say heaven and earth, and we try to convey it in English by Welkin and Tartarus. Yeah, but it's everywhere. You see in line 86, there's again heaven and earth is one of the most common couplets in Mesopotamia, and it appears in this text several times, and each one of them expressed with a different pair of words. Yeah.
Very fascinating.
So this is a way of that the Mesopotamians have of sort of being very clever, and in a way this marks the text as derivative of actual poetic text that use sort of lexical variation in a much more rational or normal way.
Mm. Do you think that the writer of this text has a Enuma Elish that he's looking at, and that he's just, copying from, or doing something like looking right at it? Or is it a situation where he's got something like on the back of his mind? Or do you think it's more just the general ideas of people in the culture?
So my impression is that he's trying to go beyond Enuma Elish. He's trying to write another tablet to Enuma Elish. This is just my impression. Yeah, Enuma Elish finishes in tablet 7. Yeah, and he wants to add another bit to Enuma Elish and say, actually, Enuma Elish doesn't say enough. Marduk is not only these gods that we saw earlier, Asharu, Neberu, these gods that no one knows. Also, the big gods, the great gods, are Marduk. Yeah? So I think what the author is trying to do is to go beyond Enuma Elish, to use the same language of Enuma Elish, but in order to go beyond what Enuma Elish says.
Fascinating. Okay, and can you explain the structure of the hymn and how it is divided into 3 main sections? Why is this significant? Why is this division significant?
Yeah, so as I said, the most on the one hand, it's interesting because the division parallels that of Enuma Elish 6 and 7. Right? You also have a list of names preceded by a small prologue and followed by an epilogue, and it's also relevant because it's some sort of small narration. At the beginning, you have Marduk as being very clever. That's one of the features of Marduk. He's always, one of the traditional epithets of Marduk is the Apkal Ili, so the sage of the gods. Yeah. So at the beginning, he's only wise, but then he magnifies his name in line 17, and then begins this long list of epithets. Yeah. And after this line, we have at the end Marduk as a king. So no longer as a sage, but also as a king, because he has taken up all the names of the god. In a way, if he has taken up all the names of the god, he can no longer be king because the other gods don't exist. So who will be king over? Right? But yeah, in this text, that doesn't really matter. He's still the king of all the gods. Yeah, he's still the mighty lead of the Igigi and the Anunnaki. Those are the 2 categories of gods that are traditionally in Mesopotamia. Yeah, the Igigi are the superior gods, the gods that live in heaven, and the Anunnaki are the ones that are usually associated with the netherworld or with the lower world. And yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. All right, and let's see here. What else we have? All right. So the hymn includes several lexical substitutions and learned names for the gods. What purposes do these linguistic choices serve in the context of the hymn? Did you have anything to add there?
No, I mean, as I said, it's just to present the text as a legitimate text, as a text that is at the same level as any other poetic text that was ever written in honor of Marduk.
Thank you. All right. And could the Eriš hymn be seen as a form of religious propaganda? aiming to elevate Marduk's status, or does it reflect a broader spiritual trend in Babylon at the time?
That is the key question in this text. Is this something real, or is this the imagination of some people? Yeah? That is also a key question for Enuma Elish, believe it or not. Is that religious propaganda, or is it actually describing a phenomenon that had already taken place? Yeah. In the case of Enuma Elish, one of the most influential scholars of the 20th century, W.G. Lambert, famously said that this was the end of a process. So Marduk is first exalted, and then in order to celebrate this exaltation that takes place over many centuries, they composed this text. Other scholars said, well, this text may as well be simply a manifesto, right? We want Marduk to be the greatest god, and therefore we composed this poem describing how he became the greatest god. Yeah? In our case, we can actually argue the same thing. We can is this text celebrating something that already taken place, or is this text sort of a manifesto for a phenomenon that was that never really materialized? It's very difficult to tell. As far as we know, all these gods continue to have their own cult separate from Marduk. Also within Babylon, so you can say, well, other cities perhaps didn't follow what the Babylonians dictated. Yeah, but also within Babylon, they continue to have independent cult or cult independent from Marduk. Yeah, and in any case, if we go back to the presentation, I would just like to make another point to the PDF. Sorry. Yeah, we know that Marduk inherited a lot of mythology from other gods. Yeah, there is a very famous case in Enuma Elish where it says, one god says to Marduk, "Go, slit Tiamat's throat, let the winds carry her blood as glad tidings." It's very strange that the winds should carry the blood, right? It's not really appropriate. How would you do it? A liquid cannot easily be carried away by the winds. And it's very clear that this is a copy from this other text, Anzu, where the gods say to Ninurta, "Kill him, conquer Anzu, let the winds bear hither his feathers as glad tidings." And feathers make sense. The winds carry them away. Yeah? Blood doesn't make any sense. Yeah? So it's very clear that Enuma Elish is taking motifs and even wording from earlier texts and adapting them in order to take the mythology from other gods and apply it to Marduk. Yeah? So in this case, it's the mythology of Ninurta. They just take it and give it to Marduk. There is an article on this topic called Ninurta mythology in the Babylonian Epic of Creation. So the interesting thing is that in the same way that Marduk steals the mythology from other gods, Marduk's mythology is also later stolen by other gods, yeah? In particular by Nabu, his son. And this is the case of the Baal temple in Palmyra that was studied a few years ago on the exaltation of Nabu. And it represents here in this panel that no longer exists because well, the temple was blown by ISIS and it's been reconstructed, but this panel had been lost already for quite a while. So in this panel, you have a god that has all the features of Nabu, so the son of Marduk, who is defeating Tiamat. And that is, of course, the main feat that Marduk accomplishes in the Epic of Creation, right? In Enuma Elish. But in this late period, this mythology had been inherited by Nabu. So those who steal, in this case, get stolen from. Marduk stole from other gods, and then other gods stole from him. So if the Eriš Shummi was promoting an agenda, it was a short-lived one and one that was forgotten soon in order to give way to other religious developments, such as the exaltation of Nabu in this case.
Wow, interesting. I did notice. So, in the relief that we're talking about here, where is Tiamat on this picture? Where is she on? Where is she on there?
So Nabu is the one at the top, in the top row to the left. You see on a chariot with a bow. Yeah, and Tiamat is the one that you can see to the right of Nabu in the next bit that is preserved.
Okay.
So Tiamat is the one that is at the top, in the top row to the left. You see on a chariot with a bow. And Tiamat is the one that you can see to the right of Nabu in the next bit that is preserved.
Okay, so there's like a little space in between it, and then it's right
Yeah,
next to it. Okay,
yeah.
very fascinating. Thank you, thank you. All right, and let's see here. What else we have? Any other things on that before we keep going?
No, no.
Okay, thank you. So that answers that question, and just want to make sure I don't miss something. How does I think we already answered this. Okay, the hymn was not included in the Babylonian school curriculum, unlike other hymns. So, what might this exclusion indicate about the text's role or perceived importance in ancient Babylonian education?
So, first of all, I want to make a point, and is that the hymn is written in prose and not in verse. Most texts that we have from Mesopotamia, most literary texts are written in verse. Right? Enuma Elish is written in verse, and Su that we just discussed is written in verse, but our text is written in sort of an elevated prose. And this elevated prose, or prose in general, was not used as often as a school text as verse, right? So in the school they prefer to copy verse. So that's maybe one of the reasons why it is excluded in the school curriculum. Another reason maybe that the text is later than other texts that made it into the school curriculum, such as Enuma Elish. And by the time the text appeared, the school curriculum was sort of closed and there was no room for other texts. If we speculate even further, we can say, we can imagine that the text is too extreme, this sort of prospective syncretism of trying to for the school, right? And perhaps that's another one of the reasons. Of there are several reasons. It's unclear which one of them played a bigger role, but there are several reasons why we can explain the exclusion of the text from the school curriculum.
Thank you. All right, and so to conclude our talk, could you remind us, just summarize what is so fascinating about this hymn? What's really stands out to you?
So the most interesting thing is that the texts tell us that all the major gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon are just part of Marduk, are just names of Marduk. This is sort of the extreme development of a phenomenon that we see in Mesopotamia almost from the beginning of Mesopotamian civilization, that has been called the main sort of driving force behind Mesopotamian religions, the so-called in German, they call it the Gleichsetzungstheologie, so the theology of equation. So you put one god the same level of another god, and you say they're both the same god. But in this text, it goes beyond that, because it takes all the big gods, all the 10, 12 major gods, and says these are just names of Marduk. In Mesopotamia, we have God list with over 1,000 entries, and most of the entries are just said to be different names of one god. Yeah? But this text sort of distills this list, takes the 10 gods that are said to have received all these names, and say that also these 10 gods are part of Marduk. So it's sort of a slippery slope, right? You begin with 1,000 gods, and these are reduced to 10 gods, and this text take it even further, and said these 10 gods are also Marduk. So the most fascinating thing is this claim, and the key is how to interpret the claim. And as I said, in the case of the Pinches list, it is a question that is still open, and in the case of this text, it's also a question that is not entirely certain what the author exactly means by equating a god with Marduk.
Thank you. So JS, he said something about mentioning electronic Babylonian library project. So I think we've been citing it, right?
Yeah. So we'll include a few links here, and it's a project that we have. In order to reconstruct texts such as this one, there are many thousands of fragments of text in museums that no one has looked at. It's very difficult to identify them. So what we try to do is to harness computers in order to help us move forward and identify even the tiniest fragment. In the case of this text, we were very successful. So apart from this one big manuscript that I showed, we found 7 others which are composed of several other tiny fragments. And here in the online edition, we include several fragments that we couldn't include in the publication because we found them too late. That's the main goal of the platform. Another goal is to make this text available in an updated, completely reliable edition. So here you will find the most recent edition of Enuma Elish, for instance, if you go to the corpus,
that's the Enuma Elish.
But if you go to the corpus, you will find Enuma Elish, Gilgamesh, all the major texts either already online or they will be online very soon. And at the bottom you will find this Eriš Šummi on the one hand, and a syncretistic hymn to Gula and a goddess, and a Macranthropic hymn to Ninurta. Perhaps I can say a thing that I didn't mention, and it's the monotheism in Mesopotamia, or syncretism in Mesopotamia, is very gender specific. So only male gods are said to be part of Marduk, and only female goddesses are equated with Gula in the hymn to Gula, so with a goddess. So in that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't really call it monotheism. It's a different thing.
Interesting. So you wouldn't call it monotheism because it's not using different sexes, it's not using both? Explain that a little further.
So there are several reasons why I wouldn't call this monotheism. One of them is that the text doesn't say all gods are Marduk. It says this set of male gods are Marduk, or this set of female goddesses are this goddess, but it doesn't really mix them up. So if in any case you will have a duality, right? A dual god that is a man on the one hand, a male god, and a female goddess. But if anything, you will have that, but not really monotheism in the sense that we understand it as. The only exception is this hymn to Ninurta that I presented, where the gods are part of his body, and they're also female. They're also goddesses among them. But that's not really exactly equation, right? It's a different kettle of fish. It's a different theological principle, so to say.
Very fascinating. Awesome. All right. And did you have anything else that you wanted my audience to know about, whether that be other books that you've written or anything else you're working on, or just anything about the paper?
No, I will invite them to look at the editions, to try to interpret them by themselves. As I said, the interpretation is still an open question, and we've been discussing the interpretation of this Pinches list for 100 years, and we still don't know exactly what it means. And I will invite them to engage directly with the texts and see what they can see in them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute pleasure. We learned a lot. Everybody can make sure to like and subscribe, and as well as check out Dr. Jiménez's work on the website, as well as in the links in the description. Thank you so much for coming on here.
Thank you very much, Zach.